Welcome back to America's Got Talent, the finale. It has been one of the best seasons I can remember. And we have your top two acts. Richard Goodall!
When Richard Goodall walked onto the America's Got Talent stage, few could have predicted what would come next. A soft-spoken school janitor with no flashy image, no industry backing, and nothing but a voice powered by raw emotion, he didn't look like a star. But within minutes, millions were wiping away tears. His performance wasn't just impressive, it felt deeply human. Overnight, Richard Goodall became one of the most unlikely and beloved breakout stars in AGT history. But once the lights dimmed and the applause faded, a much bigger question lingered. What really happened next? For fans, the assumption was simple music deals, instant fame, and a transformed life. That's how these stories usually go. Yet, behind the scenes, Richard's reality unfolded very differently. The sudden attention brought opportunities, yes, but it also brought pressure, expectations, and difficult personal choices that no one saw on television. Fame arrived faster than he could fully process, forcing him to decide whether to chase a dream he never planned for or hold on to the life that shaped him. In the days following AGT, Richard faced emotional crossroads most performers never talk about. The industry wanted him to move fast. The public wanted constant updates. And yet, the man audiences fell in love with was still rooted in humility, someone who valued stability, purpose, and authenticity over celebrity. Whispers began to circulate online. Why wasn't he everywhere? Why didn't he disappear into the usual post-show spotlight? Some called it a missed opportunity. Others suspected something deeper was happening behind closed doors. The truth, as it turns out, is far more personal and far more powerful than anyone expected. Now, with time passed and clarity gained, the real story of Richard Goodall, after America's Got Talent, is finally coming into focus. It's not a tale of instant superstardom, but of quiet courage, grounded decisions, and redefining what success truly means. And once you hear what really happened after AGT, you may never look at overnight fame the same way again. When Richard Goodall first stepped onto the America's Got Talent stage, the moment felt almost deceptively simple. He didn't arrive with a sob story crafted for television, nor did he carry the polished confidence of a seasoned performer. He was a school janitor, soft-spoken, humble, visibly nervous, and that alone set him apart. Yet, within seconds of opening his mouth, the room changed. His voice carried not only power, but years of quiet perseverance. And the audience felt it immediately. Richard's performance struck a chord because it wasn't about spectacle. It was about authenticity. In a competition often dominated by high-energy acts and dramatic visuals, he stood still and sang from somewhere deep and unguarded. Viewers saw themselves in him, someone who had spent most of life unseen, quietly showing up every day, never expecting applause. That relatability turned him into an overnight symbol of hope that dreams don't expire and talent doesn't require a spotlight to exist. After the episode aired, Richard's life shifted at a speed he hadn't prepared for. Social media erupted. Clips of his audition spread rapidly, accompanied by messages from people who said his voice had moved them to tears. Interviews requests poured in. Strangers recognized him in public. For someone who had lived a largely private life, the sudden attention was overwhelming in ways both uplifting and unsettling. Behind the scenes, Richard returned to the same school hallways, the same routine, and the same quiet responsibilities he'd always held. That contrast became one of the most challenging aspects of his post-AT reality. One moment, he was being celebrated as an inspiration on national television. The next, he was back behind the scenes of everyday life, processing changes no one had warned him about. As the competition progressed, expectations intensified. Fans assumed his path was now fixed, that a recording contract, tours, and celebrity status were inevitable. But Richard didn't see his journey in those terms. While deeply grateful for the platform AGT gave him, he also felt the weight of choices he never planned to make. Fame wasn't something he had chased. It arrived uninvited, demanding immediate decisions about identity, purpose, and direction. One of the hardest adjustments was internal. Richard struggled with the idea that people suddenly saw him differently. Praise felt unfamiliar and, at times, undeserved in his own eyes. He had spent most of his life working quietly, finding dignity and consistency rather than recognition. Now, public validation came faster than personal acceptance could keep up. Throughout the show, Richard remained grounded, often reminding himself why he sang in the first place. Music had always been personal, a source of expression rather than ambition. Turning that private connection into a public role challenged him in unexpected ways. Every performance carried not just competition pressure, but the fear of losing the authenticity that made him connect with audiences to begin with. As AGT moved forward, Richard's storyline became one of sincerity rather than spectacle. He wasn't trying to reinvent himself. He was trying to survive the moment without losing who he was. That quiet resistance to becoming a packaged success resonated deeply with viewers and unknowingly laid the foundation for what would happen after the show ended. By the time his AGT journey reached its conclusion, Richard Goodall was no longer just a contestant, he was a conversation. People debated what success should look like for someone like him. And Richard himself was left standing between two worlds, one familiar and steady, the other full of possibility but riddled with pressure. What happened next would surprise many, and disappoint some, but for Richard, it would be the most honest choice of his life. When America's Got Talent wrapped and the cameras finally turned away, Richard Goodall expected a return to normal. What he didn't expect was how impossible normal would feel after the world had briefly seen him as something more. Fame doesn't shut off when a season ends, it lingers. And for Richard, that lingering attention became both a gift and a burden. In the weeks following the finale, opportunities began to appear. Some were genuine, others vague promises dressed up as life-changing deals. Industry conversations moved quickly, often assuming Richard wanted the same thing everyone else wanted: immediate stardom. Managers spoke about image. Producers talked about relocation. Schedules were drafted before he'd even decided what future he wanted. The pace was dizzying, and for someone who had spent a lifetime moving slowly and deliberately, it felt invasive. What many didn't realize was that Richard was quietly struggling. The sudden shift in identity from janitor to national inspiration created a pressure he never asked for. People projected their dreams onto him, expecting him to win life just because he'd won their hearts. But behind closed doors, Richard was wrestling with fear, self-doubt, and the very real question of whether chasing fame would cost him the peace he'd spent decades building. Returning to work became both grounding and painful. Some colleagues treated him exactly the same, which he appreciated. Others treated him like someone who no longer belonged there. Whispers followed him through hallways. Well-meaning comments like, "You won't be here much longer," landed heavier than most people realized. The job that once defined stability now felt uncertain, not because he hated it, but because others assumed he was supposed to outgrow it. Social media intensified everything. Fans asked why he wasn't releasing music, touring, or signing deals. Some accused him of wasting his moment. Others defended his right to choose his own path. Richard read more than he should have, absorbing opinions that conflicted with his instincts. The world seemed impatient with his silence, unaware that he was processing one of the biggest transitions of his life. At the core of his struggle was a simple truth. Richard never auditioned for AGT to escape his life. He auditioned because he loved music. Fame was a side effect, not a goal. And the more pressure he felt to transform into a celebrity, the more he questioned whether that transformation would come at the expense of authenticity. Eventually, Richard made a decision that confused many but brought him relief. He chose not to rush. He declined offers that demanded immediate, full-scale commitment. He didn't disappear, but he did step back. Instead of capitalizing aggressively on exposure, he focused on reclaiming control over his narrative. In an industry that thrives on urgency, his patience was almost radical. That choice came with consequences. Momentum slowed. Headlines faded. The spotlight shifted elsewhere. But something else happened too. Richard began to breathe again. Without constant pressure to perform a version of himself for others, he reconnected with why singing mattered to him in the first place. He continued making music quietly, on his own terms. Small performances, personal projects, moments unrecorded by broadcast cameras. While the world labeled his post-AGT path as unexpected, Richard saw it as necessary. He hadn't failed to become a star, he'd chosen to remain himself. This chapter of Richard Goodall's journey wasn't about rejection by the industry. It was about resistance to becoming something he never set out to be. And though the noise around him slowly faded, his sense of purpose grew stronger. What followed next would prove that success doesn't always arrive loud, fast, or televised, and that sometimes the bravest move is stepping away before losing yourself. As the spotlight dimmed and public expectations shifted elsewhere, Richard Goodall entered the quietest and most misunderstood phase of his journey. To many observers, his reduced visibility looked like retreat. But for Richard, it was something entirely different: recalibration. Free from cameras and commentary, he finally had the space to decide what role music would play in his everyday life, not as a headline, but as a constant. This period wasn't easy. The absence of noise can be just as confronting as its presence. Without the applause, Richard had to confront lingering doubts. Had he made the right choice? Had he let fear override opportunity? Those questions crept in during solitary moments, amplified by the occasional reminder of what might have been. Yet the more time passed, the clearer his internal compass became. Peace, he realized, mattered more than proof. Music gradually found its way back into his routine, not as obligation, but as comfort. Richard sang when he felt moved, not when an algorithm or schedule demanded it. He practiced privately, refining his voice not for competition, but for expression. These quiet sessions reconnected him with the joy that had fueled his first performance, long before talent scouts or television audiences entered the picture. Outside influence remained, though subtle. Fans continued reaching out, sharing how his AGT appearance had inspired them through difficult moments. Those messages grounded him. They reminded him that impact isn't measured by chart positions or ticket sales. Sometimes, a single performance ripples through lives in ways no career roadmap can predict. Financial realities also played a role in shaping his decisions. Fame may appear glamorous from afar, but without long-term structures, it can be unstable. Richard valued security, independence, and sustainability, things that don't always align with entertainment industry promises. By maintaining his regular life while nurturing music organically, he ensured he wasn't trading stability for uncertainty masquerading as success. Over time, conversations about Richard shifted. Instead of what happened to him, people began asking, what is he choosing? That distinction mattered. It reframed his narrative from lost opportunity to intentional living. He wasn't failing to keep up with fame, he was opting out of its demands. Richard also confronted the reality of how society defines achievement. For many, leaving fame appears foolish. For Richard, resisting it felt powerful. Success, he concluded, isn't about transformation into something unrecognizable. It's about alignment between values, actions, and identity. Youth chase attention. Wisdom chooses coherence. Though he stayed largely outside the media, Richard didn't disappear. He accepted select opportunities that felt genuine and manageable. When he performed, it was with clarity, free of pressure to impress. Audiences noticed. Those who heard him sing again remarked on the calm behind his voice, a steadiness that comes from choosing authenticity over applause. The man who once stood trembling under AGT lights had evolved, but not into a celebrity archetype. He became something rarer, a person who experienced sudden visibility and chose self-respect over spectacle. That choice, while quieter, carried lasting weight. As this phase settled into rhythm, one truth became undeniable: Richard Goodall's story was never meant to follow a typical fame arc. His impact was rooted not in sustained attention, but in the reminder that dignity, purpose, and passion can coexist without performance contracts. And just when many assumed his story had ended, Richard prepared to re-enter the conversation, not as a contestant or cautionary tale, but as someone finally clear on who he was. Regardless of who was watching, by the time Richard Goodall quietly re-emerged into public awareness, something about him had shifted, not outwardly, but at the core. He no longer carried the tentative uncertainty that followed him after America's Got Talent. Instead, there was calm. Not the absence of ambition, but the presence of clarity. He had lived through attention, temptation, and expectation and chosen intention instead. Richard's return wasn't marked by flashy announcements or desperate attempts to reclaim relevance. It came through small, meaningful moments, Intimate performances, organic sharing of music and conversations that centered on purpose rather than promotion. Listeners noticed immediately. His voice carried the same emotional power, but now it was steadier, more assured. Shaped by experience rather than nerves, what truly defined Richard's post-AGT life wasn't what he pursued, but what he refused. He declined projects that demanded image reinvention or rushed timelines. He protected his autonomy fiercely, understanding now that control is the most valuable currency an artist can have. Where once he worried about letting people down, he now understood that living truthfully was the only obligation that mattered. The school where he once worked remained an important part of his identity, not as a fallback, but as a reminder of grounding. Fame had flirted with his life, not replaced it. That distinction allowed him to stay connected to community, humility, and routine elements that kept ego in check and meaning intact. Richard never saw dignity in leaving behind who he used to be. He saw power in honoring it. Over time, the narrative around him softened. The phrase, "what could have been faded," replaced by something more respectful. He chose well. People who once criticized his absence began to understand that success isn't always expansion, it can also be refinement. Richard became an example of deliberate living in a world addicted to escalation. His relationship with music deepened. Without industry interference, his sound matured organically. When he sang, it wasn't to be discovered again. It was to connect. Every note carried the weight of someone who had stood at the edge of massive change and stepped back, not out of fear, but out of self-knowledge. Richard also became a quiet source of inspiration in ways that didn't require stage lights. His story circulated among people facing crossroads of their own, those debating between security and risk, noise and peace. He never framed his choices as superior, only personal. That humility was what made his journey resonate so strongly. Looking back, Richard Goodall's time on America's Got Talent appears not as a launchpad, but as a mirror. It showed him what he could become and, more importantly, what he didn't need to be. Insight, not exposure, was the true prize. Today, Richard measures success differently. Not by recognition, but by alignment. Not by applause, but by fulfillment. He sings because it matters to him, not because a schedule demands it. And in doing so, he reminds us that dreams don't always ask to be chased sometimes. They ask to be respected. In the end, what really happened to Richard Goodall after a GT is this: he didn't disappear, fall short, or miss his shot. He chose a life that made sense to him. And that choice, quiet, steady, and deeply human, may be the most powerful outcome of all.